Terrified and excited to be standing here behind this pulpit this morning, so I appreciate your support and having me be here. I struggled with the title of this sermon. It went through many different titles. It was Who's the Author? It was Put the Pen Down. It was Which Story is Yours? When Pastor asked me to cover for him one Sunday in his absence, I knew right away what I wanted to talk about, and that was the story of the Prodigal Son. But as my luck would have it, he gave that sermon a couple of weeks ago. So, and then a couple of weeks ago, he talked about a story about Jesus drawing lines in the sand. And I knew then that the story that I wanted to tell through the Prodigal Son was really more in depth than that. And so this is really a beautiful continuation to some of the things that Pastor's already been speaking about. And I love that God always does that. He takes kind of what we think is going to happen, and he's, in control, and he makes something beautiful out of it. So I hope you'll hang in with me this morning. What I also know about sermons and those who give them is that oftentimes the message is more for the person giving the sermon than for those hearing it. So I'm definitely in for a talking to this morning. Would you pray with me? Father, I thank you so much for this awesome responsibility of sharing your word today. Lord, I don't take it lightly. I just ask, Father, that you would shove me aside, Lord, and that you would do the speaking through me, Lord, that the words we hear today would be yours and the message would be one that you want us to hear. I pray that you'd open our eyes and our hearts and minds to really look inside of us today and also to take a fresh look at other people. I thank you for your grace, your mercy, and your love. And it's in your Son's name we come boldly before your throne, Christ Jesus, our Lord and Savior. And all God's kids said, amen. I have to tell you that, I prepared the sermon, and the more times you read something, sometimes you're like, I don't even like it anymore. So, but I do like it this morning. And I know that there has to be something about it that God wants to be delivered because, Satan's at work. And if anybody knows me, I can't exist without coffee, and my coffee maker broke this morning. So here we go. If you'll kindly hang in with me for a short little bit, I want to talk about authors today. So whether we realize it or not, we all think that we are excellent writers. Even math and science types, you too. We all think that we're excellent writers, and we write stories all of the time, kind of narratives that happen in our own mind. If you're anything like me or my friends or my family, we write elaborate stories, particularly in the information age that we're in, with text messages or phone calls. As a for instance, if you call somebody and they don't answer the phone, then you instantly go, well, where are they? What happened? I mean, it can sometimes even lead to panic. Is everything okay? Should I send a police officer over there? Maybe I should just drive over there now. Oh, good. I'm glad you've done this too. And sometimes, we send a text message. I'll send a text to somebody and be like, so are we on for lunch tomorrow? And they don't respond. Within the allotted time, I've made up in my mind that they should have responded in. And then instantly, I thought we were having lunch. Maybe they don't want lunch. Maybe they don't eat lunch anymore, and that's why they didn't respond, because they don't eat lunch, and I forgot that they don't eat lunch, and now they're offended, and on and on. Oh, can you do that too? Relieved. And even sometimes when we write the story, in this instance, it can lead to horrific thoughts, probably from watching too many crime dramas on TV. If I text my daughter at nighttime, she's in college, before I go to bed, and I say, how was your night? And she didn't respond. Well, then instantly, I'm ashamed to say, was she with friends? She's been kidnapped. Who knows her whereabouts? In reality, the truth is, I left my phone at home and I ran an errand. I fell asleep. I was in the shower. I was in the bath. I was playing with the kids. My phone was on silent from work, and I didn't hear your call. But we already in our own minds have made up this entire story about what possibly has happened or why they haven't responded. So if we write stories based upon someone's lack of response to us, we also write stories sometimes based on someone's response to us, do we not? A number of years ago, I worked with a sales company, and one of the trainings that we had often was about the no next theory. So if you haven't been in sales, I'll kind of give you a glimpse about it. Basically, the no next theory talks about that a no in response to something shouldn't be taken personally necessarily, but it's very easy to do that. If I said to you, let me see what we got under this pulpit. If I said to you, would you like to buy this yellow highlighter? And you said, no. That no had nothing to do with me, most likely, except that in our minds, we can write an entire story based upon why you didn't want to buy this yellow highlighter from me. We think if I was more professional, then they would have wanted this yellow highlighter. I didn't do a good enough job at explaining why this yellow highlighter is something, they should buy. If I was more intelligent, if I spoke more eloquently, if I was more beautiful, then perhaps they would want this yellow highlighter. In truth, they just bought a highlighter yesterday. They didn't budget for a highlighter today. They don't like yellow highlighters. They prefer green highlighters, and so on. But already in our minds, we've written this elaborate story about why the answer is no and how it affects us without once seeking to find out anything about them. Sometimes, and I'm going off script here, this was not planned, but I'm going to share this with you. Sometimes we write stories not even based upon someone's lack of response or their response to us. Sometimes we write stories just based on their person, just someone being there. They don't even have to say anything. Right? So my husband and I, and I'm sorry I didn't prepare you for this, love, I apologize. My husband and I have been married coming into 3 years now. Tack on COVID years, it's probably like 5 or 10. But when we were first married, we were having company over the house. And so everybody's kind of busying around. It was a Saturday morning. And so I decided I'm going to mop the floor. And I remember this story so clearly because it's a really ugly picture of myself. Sometimes we hold on to those. And I'm mopping the floor, and I look over, and out of the corner of my eye, I see my loving husband standing in between the kitchen and the living room where I'm mopping. And I feel this yuck start to bubble up in me. And I am just really mad. I just kind of took over my whole person. And I couldn't figure out why. And I think I probably even snapped at you, and I said, what? I know, can you believe it? And it wasn't until after he kind of moved on and went about his way doing other things, and it took me a while mopping the floor to figure out what in the world was my problem. And my problem was I felt under thumb. I felt like he was standing there, ready to point out the spot that I missed, and watching and seeing how good of a job I had done. And that's why I felt angry. And so that story that I had written about my husband, who did nothing, by the way, but stand there, I wrote this story like, that he was just standing there to pass judgment, that he was going to just point out what spot I missed. And I wrote a whole story just based on his person. And when I realized that the story I had written for him was based upon my own experience, my own past experience, things that I had felt in the past or things that I had experienced. And after sharing this with him later, apologizing for my coldness and why I felt that way and what I thought he was doing, only then did he share with me that he was actually just standing there waiting to find out how else he could be helpful. That when they were kids on Saturday morning and their mom was buzzing around, they would wait for the next assignment. What else can we do? But I wrote an ugly story for him based on only my experience, only my perspective. And it was completely unfair. So we write stories too, based on someone's person, what they did or what they didn't do. And it's important to note, too, when we write stories, it's often shaded, clouded with our own perspective as well. So I've chosen to use my phone as my notes today, which is the tiniest thing, so I apologize. That's what happens when I go off book, everybody. The danger in writing people's story is that we're surface writing. We're writing a story from only one perspective, ours. Some people might say, well, that was my truth. My truth. We've heard that before. And I have to be honest with you. I am tired of that saying, my truth. If there's any one thing today that you can take and tuck in your heart, is that there's one truth. One. What God says about you or about somebody else, that is the truth. That's the truth. It's like the line we've heard before, there's two sides to every story and the truth lies in between. So it's not my truth, but my perspective. One truth, different perspectives. One of my favorite places on earth, I want to talk about perspectives for a minute, is Cadillac Mountain. Now, Cadillac Mountain sits just near Bar Harbor, Maine. Anybody been there before? Excellent. It's a mountain that sits in the middle of this little island off the coast of Maine. The view from Cadillac Mountain is extraordinary. And this is it here for you to see. This is also the view from Cadillac Mountain. Both taken from the top of the mountain, different perspectives. One person might say, my truth is that the view from Cadillac Mountain overlooks trees, and it's green, and it's the wide state of Maine, it's beautiful. Someone else might say, my truth is that Cadillac Mountain overlooks the Atlantic Ocean with dots of islands off in the distance. It's just breathtaking. Both true, right? Different perspectives. One who chose to hike up this mountain, like maybe Jeff DeVries and Brian and Tabitha, they choose to hike up the mountain, they might say, the hike up there was long and arduous. I mean, kind of rocky trails, ducking under branches, and so forth. One far more adventurous might say, climbing up steep rock formations. And it took hours to get there. While the other, who chose to drive up the mountain, might say, it was a little winding, but it was overall a fairly smooth, picturesque view, and it took about 30 minutes. Both true? Yeah. Different perspectives. See, we have to be so careful in our innate nature as writers to write someone's story with only surface data, with our perspective rather than to seek and understand theirs. The Bible puts this out for us in no uncertain terms in Proverbs 18:2, when it says, a fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing one's opinion. Or in James 1:19, when it says we should be quick to listen and slow to speak. And to wrap that up, in essence, Franklin Covey put it in one of his principles, seek first to understand, then to be understood. Right? We have some teachers in our midst, so I hope that you'll agree with this statement when I say, you can give me a nod, make sure I'm on the right track, that good writers have to focus on character development. I'm getting nods, we're on the right track. Really understanding a character and what's made them and what shaped them, what makes them who they are. When people, you see like on TV or skits, when people pretend to be actors, they say, what's my motivation, right? The Christmas Carol, the beloved Christmas story by Charles Dickens would mean nothing if we didn't have glimpses into Ebenezer Scrooge's past, present, and future. Instead, it would probably be a terrible story, and we would be uninterested with this angry, miserable man, would we not? Without seeking out what someone else's perspective is, we write a shallow story, often unfair of others, and the way that they affect us or other people. So if we naturally write stories, then becoming a good writer is something that we should aspire to. And working on our literary skills this way also helps us to do the things that we're called to do as followers of Christ in terms of love and of service and of forgiveness. So in terms of love, loving the unlovable. Sandpaper people. The second greatest command we're given, second only to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, is love your neighbor as yourself. We see this in Mark. We see it in Matthew. We see it several more times throughout the Bible, reminding us to love your neighbor as yourself. I'm going to go back to Ebenezer on this one. Wasn't it easier to bestow love on this character when we saw his past, his hurts and his pains? For sure. In terms of service, how can we really serve someone if we don't seek to understand what their real needs are? In my family, feeding people is an act of love and an act of service. But if my son falls down and scrapes up his knee, offering him a roll is not going to help much. If I gave him a Band-Aid, that would be a much better way to serve him, no? And I have to tell you that it's taken me a really long time to realize that there's some things in this world that bread won't fix. And I really love bread. And then, forgiveness. Hurt people hurt people. We've heard this phrase before, and sometimes it's true. Unfortunately, more than sometimes, it's true. Or hurt people hurt themselves in destructive choices or those kinds of things. Injustices, hurt, trespasses, if you want to get King James with it, can all be difficult to forgive, especially when they're egregious. But we're called to do that. We're called to do that. And that's the very nature of God. So the sermon that Pastor gave a number of weeks ago talked about Jesus drawing lines in the sand. It's found in John 8, 1 through 11. And it made me think about the stories we write and the truth. So men dragged this woman up to Jesus, calling her out for adultery. And they were trying to trick Jesus, is what they were doing. And they reminded Jesus that the law says that she's to be stoned to death. They want to know what his response is. So he starts drawing lines in the sand. We don't know what he wrote. We don't. If you didn't catch the sermon, definitely give it a listen. But what he does tell the men is, any of you who is without sin, throw the first stone. And none do. And then he looks at the woman, and he forgives her, tells her to change her ways and leave her life of sin. It's in the very nature of God to offer such grace and mercy. Remember, too, God knows everything about us. Everything. Luke 12:7, did I even put it here? I didn't. It says that he knows how many hairs are on our head. Every one of us. So we don't know much about this woman. But God does. Jesus did. Perhaps this woman called out for adultery, was abused, mistreated, cast off, unloved in her past. Maybe she was deceived. We don't know. But Jesus did. None of these things, by the way, excuse her behavior. The consequences for our actions don't go away. But seeking to understand what shaped her changes our heart's attitude toward her. It's really easy to point out the obvious missteps of others. But does a mistake make a person? Or rather what one does to make that right with God and with other people? In the sermon Pastor gave a few weeks ago, he touched on the story of the Prodigal Son. So same thing here. If you missed that sermon, definitely give it a listen. But let me give you the quick kind of snapshot of the story found in Luke 15, 11 through 31. One father, two sons. Youngest son says, I want my inheritance. Excuse me. Father gives it to him, and he goes off. And he squanders everything away, living wildly, as we're told. When he kind of has squandered everything, and I'm going to add to this, the other brother, the older brother, stayed home and continued on his father's legacy. So when the youngest son spent everything he had, a severe famine hit the land, and he found himself hungry, and he was in need. And he got work slopping pigs. And he was so hungry that he longed to eat what the pigs ate. Ugh. And if you've ever seen pig slop, it is slop. It's named that for a reason. But he was so hungry, he looked at that and just longed to eat that. And then he realized that my father's very servants have enough to eat and they are cared for. And what he says is this: I'll arise and go to my father, and I'll say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your servants. Now when he arrived home, his father saw him off in the distance and ran to him and hugged him and kissed him and told his servants to get him a robe and a ring and to gather and prepare a feast and to celebrate. He says, for my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now he's found. They didn't have cell phones back then or even landlines. He had no idea where his son was. So he was just elated that he was home. Now, when the older son heard of this, he was angry and he wouldn't join in. And his response to his father in verse 29 was, but he answered his father, look, these many years I've served you and I've never disobeyed your command. Yet you never once gave me the young goat that I can celebrate with my friends. But this son of yours, ooh, can you hear that tone? This son of yours, who's devoured your property with prostitutes, you kill the fattened calf for him? For him? And the father answered to him in verse 31, Son, you're always with me, and all that's mine is yours. It's a great story. The story is so multifaceted. Really, in its entirety, it talks about the nature of God. But what we don't often focus on is the older brother, the other brother who wrote his own story of the events. He was so focused on the fact that he was the good son. The good son. He stayed and did all the right things. How can my brother just take off? He just takes off and squanders everything away, and he gets a party upon his return. How can my father just forget everything he's done and celebrate him upon his return? Once more, we see the heart of the Father, the grace that's offered. Now, a lot of people struggle with this story, and I wonder why that is. I actually spent a lot of time, which is why I told you I knew exactly what I wanted to talk about. I spent a lot of time thinking about this. Why do we struggle with this story? Are we struggling with the heart of the Father? Is that what we struggle with? Do we struggle with the prodigal and his behavior? What is it? Do we side a little bit? Do we write the story? Do we forget? If I asked you to recall the story of the prodigal son to someone, I believe more often than not, I would love to be proven wrong. But people give the snapshot like, yeah, there's two sons. The youngest son goes off and lives wildly, and then he comes home, and the father's like, oh my gosh, I love you, come home. And that's the end of the story, usually, because that's kind of the snapshot. So we write the story, and we forget a little bit about the actual story, what actually occurred. Do we side with the older brother a little bit? Like, yeah, what about him? The youngest son just gets a party? In the natural order of things. I wonder if we side with them a little bit. Now, all we know about the prodigal son is that he was living wildly. And I don't want us to forget about the part of the story that the son comes home and he comes back to beg for mercy, just hoping to work as a servant for his father. He doesn't waltz back in the door, kick his shoes off, grab a can of Pringles, pop his butt on the couch, and say, oh, hey, I'm back. That's not what happened. It's important that we don't forget that part of the story. But the older son doesn't know this yet, and he wants justice in this regard. He's the one worthy of a party. He sees the obvious missteps of his brother, but he doesn't care to see any of the story behind it. And I wonder if the story would look differently if the brother knew this part. I wonder. And if the older brother is worried about the what now, so he's back and he gets a party, what now? Don't we know that the younger brother's consequences don't go away? I hope we know that. They'll still be there. But the heart of the father instead says, I'm just glad you're home. He says, I love you first. I love you more than your mistakes. I just want you home, and then we'll sort it out. The story stops there in the Bible. We don't know what happens after that with either brother. But what I do know is that for every action, there's a reaction. In every cause, there's an effect. And I don't know of any child who, after cautioning to be careful, smashes a baseball through the house window, and then the father or the mother runs out and scoops him up and is like, oh, let's go have ice cream. Right? That doesn't happen. Let's leave that broken window mess there forever and hope nobody hurts themselves. No, that doesn't happen. That's why we struggle a little bit with that story, right? Because we're like, that's not the natural order of things, that we just get a hug and a kiss first. But God says, yes, it is. Yes, it is. So I have to believe that there's still a mess to clean up, wrongs to be made right. And I have to believe, like any good father, and God is the best, that the consequences still remain. Just like tending a garden to grow healthy and strong, there have to be times of pruning, which can sometimes hurt. But in cleaning up the mess that we make, he's shaping us like the jar of clay, right? And the best part is that we don't do it alone. He's right there with us. It's a little tangential. Going back to the brother. Now, the older brother, who is blinded to all of this in his rage or anger, he doesn't seek to understand the father's heart or the brother's mess. He writes a self-centered story based upon his perspective. But he did, and I didn't. And that's the story he writes for his brother. And that's where he stands. And I love that the father's response to him is, don't you know everything I have is yours? Basically, yay. Yay. I'm so glad you didn't make the mistakes your brother has. I'm so glad you didn't endure the pain your brother has, because you didn't make the mistakes he did. You have never felt the pangs of hunger. You have never felt the loneliness he's felt. You don't understand the destruction that he may have left, the holes in his heart, right? The harm he may have done to other people, the harm he may have done to his own body, the darkness that engulfed him. Yay! I'm thrilled for that. Now, whether the brother made that choice, and he did, on his own, decided to go off, sometimes we go like, well, they did it. They did it to themselves. Sure. I've made an ugly mess of things all by myself. But that doesn't, God's saying, that's not what we focus on. So I'm so glad. I'm so glad that you didn't get into that mess. Thank you. You know, we're given a path to follow. It's pretty clearly outlined in the Bible. If you want to find it, there it is. You know, I don't think God gives us these rules because he's like, I want you to have the most boring life that's ever existed. I don't want you to have any fun. And I don't think that's the way God is at all. But he gives us these things to say, like, this is how to have the best, most fulfilling life. And sometimes we veer off. Sometimes we veer off. But the mistake doesn't make the person. We've all done it, and we've all been there. And I think the most incredible thing about God is that he says he doesn't have a scale. Sometimes we have problems with that too. So you mean to tell me because I stubbed my toe and said a word I probably shouldn't have, that is on the same level, that sin is the same level as someone who went out and murdered somebody? God says, sin is a sin is a sin. Yuck is yuck. But he cleans us and makes us new. All right, tangent again. As authors, going back to that idea, we don't need to write an ugly story for people either. They are already very familiar with that story. Very familiar. And if they don't know that story already, then I feel sure God will let them know as he changes their hearts. No heart has ever been changed by force. Hearts are only changed by love and by understanding, and of course by our Heavenly Father and the work of the Holy Spirit. We're informed in Scripture that God does not need us to be the judge and jury, and yet even when we don't realize it, writing a story for someone else on its most destructive levels can do just that. Set them up for judgment rather than love and acceptance. And finally, sometimes we even write God's story, and that is a dangerous practice. When things don't look the way we think. God must not love me, or else why would I be going through this? God said he would fill in the blank. I really felt like God wanted me to fill in the blank. But this isn't how I thought it was going to look. I feel like God wants me to blank. I can't do that. He doesn't understand me. Unfortunately, this isn't new, and we see this trend throughout the Bible. Sarah, the wife of Abraham, in Genesis, by the way, the very beginning of the Bible, the rest of it, I mean, people tell stories all the way throughout the Bible. But Sarah, the wife of Abraham, is a perfect example of writing the story, and not only just writing the story, but she ended up taking the reins and putting her narrative in action. We're first introduced to her in Genesis 11. I'm going to tell you the quick story of Sarah. I wasn't going to go there, but I'm going to. We're first introduced to Sarah, Genesis 11. All right, this is like a speed round. As the wife of Abraham, who we know is the father of nations, we're told in verse 30 that she's unable to conceive a child. Chapter 12, God tells Abraham that he is going to make him into a great nation when he was around 75 years old. Chapter 13, God tells Abraham once more that he'll make his offspring so many it would be like the dust of the earth. Once again, in chapter 15, he says that his offspring will be as many as the stars in the sky, and Abraham believed the Lord. In chapter 16, Sarah, knowing of God's promise to Abraham and having borne no children yet, says, the Lord has kept me from having children. She says this to her husband. So go sleep with my slave Hagar and have a child, through her. Sarah wrote God's story, took what God said, and twisted the narrative. So God's kept me from having children, so I'll help him out. Maybe this is the way the story's supposed to go. Viewing things from only her perspective, she wrote a narrative for God. Perhaps he didn't mean me, so I'll insert myself, and I'll write the story. Abraham bore a son with Hagar, and Sarah despised her for it. Chapter 17, God tells Abraham that in fact Sarah will bear a son at the age of 91, and Abraham was 100 years old. And that's who his great nation will be found in. And in chapter 18, once more, Sarah writes God's story and even laughs at the thought that in their old age they would have a child, to which the angels of the Lord responded. In verse 14, is anything too hard for the Lord? And God was faithful. How about the Israelites wandering through the desert? God is leading them out of slavery and into the promised land. And yet, unfortunately, some of the story of the Israelites that we remember most is that they grumbled the whole way. I'm hungry. God sent us out here to starve. I'm tired. I said, we're going to promised land, and this is just desert after desert. Like kids in the back seat, like, are we there yet? It wasn't quite what they thought their story should look like. Some were even willing to go back to slavery. Like, this is the pits. Let's go back there. It wasn't what they thought their story should look like. They started to write the story for God. And yet, God was faithful. Pastor says he's coming in for a landing, so I'm going to copy that. Hang in with me another few minutes, and I'm coming in for a landing, I promise. Not long ago, I watched the story of the movie The Shack again. And I want to be very, very, very clear that the movie and the book, The Shack, is an act of fiction. It is not the Bible. But it does illustrate some of the aspects of God, and it's wonderfully done. One scene hit me harder while watching it this time, and I wanted to share it with you. I was going to actually show it to you, but it's tough to watch. The story of The Shack centers around a man named Mac, and it tells of his experience in meeting God. And I mean actually meeting God. Now, Mac has encountered serious pain in his life. He, from the abuse of his father to the horrific loss of his daughter, Missy. And in one scene, Mac is asked to pass judgment, not on himself, but on other people and on God. And puzzled at the thought, he's told, why are you surprised? You have spent your whole life judging nearly everyone and everything, their actions and their motivations, as if you could even know them. You make snap judgments by the color of someone's skin, by their clothing, by their body language. By all accounts, you are a well-practiced expert or author. And then he's asked, what about the selfish, the greedy, those who harm others, murderers, drug dealers, terrorists? Guilty? And Mac answers, yes. Then it gets a little closer to Mac's experiences. What about men who beat their wives or fathers who beat their sons to alleviate their own suffering? Should that man be judged? And Mac says, yes. Then Mac is shown visuals of a young boy, abused, afraid, hiding from his father. And then the judge says, what about this boy? Would you judge him? And Mac's confused and he says, he's just a kid. And the judge says, but you already have. That man is your father. The questions continue. And Mac even comes to a point where he blames God. And so the judge says, well, if it's so easy for you to judge God, then you must choose one of your children to spend eternity in hell and the other to spend the eternity in heaven. Choose. And he says, that's not fair. This isn't fair. I won't do it. She said, I'm only asking you to do something that you believe God does. So choose. And she says, what about Kate, his daughter? Kate said some pretty hurtful things. She shuts you out. You're not even sure that she loves you anymore. What about Josh, his son? He's been disobedient. He's been sneaking out. He's been lying to you. You didn't know that? So make your choice. And Max says, I won't. It's not fair. It's not fair. You take me. You take me. I'll go in their place, and you leave my kids alone. You take me. And the judge looks at him and says, Mackenzie, you've judged your children worthy of love. And now, well, worthy of love even if it costs you everything. Everything. And the judge says, now you know God's heart. Just hit me harder this time. Philippians 2:3-5 says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but to each of you to the interests of the others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset of Christ Jesus. And it goes on to talk about his humility. If we could look at everybody with a God lens, a better perspective, if we see everybody as his children and worthy of love, if we seek to understand those rather than to be heard and understood, I believe we wouldn't just see a change in the hearts of others, but a softening of our own, with a clearer perspective, a heavenly perspective. And I believe that we'd see relationships healing in our very midst. So the challenge today is, why don't we just put the pen down and let God be the author, the true author? We'll leave him at work. One truth, right? God's truth. What he says about you or about somebody else, that's the truth. Is there a story that you've been writing? Maybe today's a good day to start a new one, while we seek to understand the whole view, one with trees and the ocean. Amen.